You do everything you're told is responsible. You work, you save, you avoid debt, you plan for the future. Your money sits quietly in a bank account. The number doesn't change much. It feels safe. But outside your account, something else is happening. Prices rise, slowly at first. Groceries cost a little more. Rent adjusts upward. Utilities follow. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. No announcements are made. No emergency speeches. No votes are held. Life simply becomes more expensive. You're told this is temporary. You're told it's normal. You're told inflation is a side effect of growth, of progress, of recovery. But your savings don't grow with it. They fall behind, quietly. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't an accident. Inflation is often described as a failure of policy, a mistake, a miscalculation. History tells a different story. Across centuries and continents, governments have returned to inflation again and again, not because it surprises them, but because it serves them. It allows spending without immediate taxation. It reduces the real value of existing debt. It shifts the cost of today's decisions into the future. And it does all of this quietly. There is no bill that says inflation tax, no line item on your bank statement, no moment where you're asked for consent. Instead, inflation works by erosion. Each year, your money buys a little less. Each year, your past effort loses a bit of its power. Each year, savers absorb a cost they never agreed to pay. Governments don't need to announce this trade-off. They don't need to explain it, because inflation spreads responsibility thinly. It blurs cause and effect. It turns political decisions into economic forces. And savers, by their nature, are the easiest group to ignore. They don't protest rising prices immediately. They don't default. They don't strike. They simply watch their purchasing power fade. This is why inflation persists even when it's unpopular, why it returns even after painful episodes, why it's framed as a problem to be managed rather than a choice to be avoided. Today's story is not about sudden hyperinflation or economic collapse. It's about something far more common and far more revealing. Why governments repeatedly turn to inflation. And why, throughout history, savers are the ones who quietly pay the price. Inflation is one of the most misunderstood forces in modern economics. It's often described simply as prices going up. But rising prices are a symptom, not the condition itself. Inflation, at its core, is about the declining purchasing power of money. It's what happens when the amount of money in a system grows faster than the real goods and services that money is meant to represent. This distinction matters because it changes who is responsible. When people see higher prices, they're encouraged to blame individual actors, greedy companies, supply shortages, unexpected crises. Sometimes those factors play a role. But historically, persistent inflation does not come from isolated price shocks. It comes from monetary decisions. Inflation is not created at the grocery store. It is created in balance sheets, budgets, and policy rooms. Another common misconception is that inflation is always visible and immediate. In reality, it often begins quietly. New money enters the system unevenly. It reaches governments, financial institutions, and large borrowers first. Only later does it filter into wages and everyday prices. This is why inflation can exist long before the public feels it. Official measures like consumer price indexes reinforce this misunderstanding. They attempt to compress millions of price changes into a single number. They smooth volatility. They substitute items. They revise baskets. The result is an average that rarely matches lived experience. Inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. Those closest to newly created money benefit first. Those on fixed incomes, savers, pensioners, wage earners, absorb the cost last. This is not a flaw of the system. It is how the system functions.
Equally misleading is the idea that inflation is always accidental, that it's an unfortunate side effect of growth or crisis response. History shows that inflation is frequently tolerated by design. Moderate inflation eases budget pressures. It reduces the real burden of existing debt. It allows governments to promise stability while quietly adjusting obligations downward. From a policy perspective, inflation is flexible. Taxes are visible and unpopular. Spending cuts create resistance. Inflation operates in the background. This is why inflation is often framed as something to be managed rather than eliminated. A target, a range, a tolerable level. But for savers, inflation is never abstract. It's not a percentage. It's the slow realization that stored effort is losing value. To understand why governments repeatedly accept this trade-off, we need to look beyond definitions and into history. Because inflation didn't become convenient in the modern era. It has served power for as long as money has existed. Inflation did not emerge as a modern accident. It is one of the oldest tools of state power.
Long before central banks, spreadsheets, or economic models, governments discovered a simple truth. Controlling money was easier than raising taxes. The Roman Empire offers one of the earliest examples. For centuries, Roman coins were made from precious metals. Their value was obvious, physical, and difficult to manipulate. But as military campaigns expanded and state expenses grew, the limits of taxation became clear. Resistance increased. Revenues lagged. So the state turned to the currency itself. Silver content in coins was gradually reduced. New coins looked the same, they carried the same markings, but each contained less metal than before. On paper, nothing changed. In reality, purchasing power quietly declined. This process was not chaotic, it was deliberate, and it worked, until confidence failed. The pattern repeated across medieval Europe. Kings clipped coins, reduced purity, issued debased currency to fund wars and courts. Each ruler promised restraint. Each justified the action as temporary. Each passed the cost forward. By the time the public reacted, the damage was already embedded in prices. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the method evolved, but the logic remained. After major wars, governments faced impossible deaths. Direct taxation threatened political stability. Default carried stigma. Inflation offered a third path. Following World War I and World War II, many countries chose inflation as a form of silent adjustment. Prices rose, wages lagged, debt burdens shrank in real terms. Savers paid the difference. No single law declared this outcome. No referendum approved it. It emerged from policy choices framed as necessity. Even in the modern era, inflation often appears during periods of crisis, but persists long after emergencies fade. Temporary measures become permanent features. Monetary expansion becomes normalized. Targets replace limits. What makes inflation especially effective as a strategy is its ambiguity. Unlike taxes, inflation does not arrive with a bill. Unlike spending cuts, it does not create immediate pain for a visible group. Its costs are distributed slowly and unevenly. This diffusion protects those responsible. When inflation rises, blame scatters. Businesses accuse supply chains. Politicians blame corporations. Central banks point to external shocks. Rarely does the conversation return to the underlying mechanism, expanding money to sustain spending beyond what the economy can support. History shows this pattern with uncomfortable consistency. Inflation is rarely the result of ignorance. It is often the result of incentives. When faced with fiscal pressure, states repeatedly choose the option that delays accountability. Inflation shifts today's costs onto tomorrow's savers.
It allows promises to be kept in nominal terms, while their real value quietly erodes. This is why inflation reappears across eras, regimes, and systems, not because leaders understand it, but because, historically, it has served them. To see why this strategy remains so attractive, we now need to examine the force that makes inflation politically irresistible: debt. Debt is the quiet force behind most inflationary decisions. On the surface, government debt looks manageable. It has maturity dates,
Interest rates, payment schedules. But those numbers are misleading because debt is measured in nominal terms while governments operate in the real world. This distinction changes everything. When a government borrows, it promises to repay a fixed amount of currency in the future. If inflation rises, that future repayment becomes easier. The numbers stay the same. The value does not. Inflation turns yesterday's debt into tomorrow's lighter burden. This is why inflation is so attractive to heavily indebted states. Raising taxes is politically visible. Cutting spending creates immediate resistance. Default damages credibility. Inflation avoids all three. It reduces debt quietly. It preserves the appearance of repayment. And it spreads the cost across the entire population, especially those holding cash, bonds, and fixed incomes. History is filled with examples. After major wars, governments often emerge with debt levels that cannot realistically be repaid through taxation alone. Inflation becomes the compromise solution. The debt is honored in name, but not in value. The process is subtle. Interest rates are held below inflation. Savings earn less than prices rise. Bondholders receive payments that look intact, but buy less every year. This is not an unintended consequence. It is the mechanism. Economists refer to this as negative real interest rates. From a saver's perspective, money is losing value even while appearing to earn interest. From a government's perspective, debt is shrinking without confrontation. This is why periods of high public debt often coincide with tolerance for higher inflation. The incentives are aligned. Borrowers benefit, debtors benefit, issuers of currency benefit, savers do not. Inflation also changes political timelines. Debt repayments stretch decades into the future. Inflation accelerates relief into the present. It allows governments to meet short-term obligations while postponing long-term consequences. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. As debt grows, inflation becomes more necessary. As inflation rises, trust erodes. As trust erodes, borrowing becomes harder, encouraging even more monetary expansion. At no point does this require malicious intent. The system rewards decisions that defer pain. Officials rarely say they are choosing inflation over savers. They say they are supporting growth, stabilizing markets, protecting employment. All of these goals may be sincere, but the outcome remains the same. Debt makes inflation politically tolerable. Inflation makes debt manageable. And in that exchange, savers become the balancing item, absorbing losses quietly, year after year. To understand how this trade-off is maintained over long periods, we need to examine the structure that keeps savers trapped in this system. That structure has a name: financial repression. Financial repression sounds technical. In practice, it is deeply personal. It describes a set of policies that quietly transfer wealth from savers to borrowers, primarily governments, over long periods of time. Unlike inflation alone, financial repression is not accidental. It is structured. Its most visible feature is interest rates kept below inflation. When this happens, saving becomes a losing proposition by design. Money earns interest in nominal terms but loses value in real terms. The longer funds remain stable, the more purchasing power erodes. For governments burdened by debt, this is not a side effect, it is the objective. Low interest rates reduce the cost of borrowing. They make large deficits sustainable. They allow refinancing without market resistance. But these benefits require one condition: savers must remain inside the system. This is where repression expands beyond rates. Capital controls limit movement. Regulations encourage or require institutions to hold government debt. Pension funds are steered toward safe assets that quietly underperform inflation. Choice narrows. Savers are not told they are being penalized. They are told they are being protected. Stability, safety, security. These words appear frequently during periods of financial repression. The reality is less comforting. When interest rates are capped and inflation rises, the real value of savings declines predictably. Over time, this erosion becomes substantial, even when inflation appears moderate. A few percentage points compounded annually is enough. Financial repression also changes behavior. People shorten time horizons. They spend sooner. They save less in domestic currency. They search for alternatives, not because they are reckless, but because preservation requires movement. Governments often respond by tightening controls further. The cycle deepens. Historically, this pattern has appeared after major debt expansions. Post-war economies used it extensively. Modern economies rely on it quietly. The key advantage of financial repression is its invisibility. There is no announcement, no explicit tax, no single policy that can be easily opposed. Instead, it emerges from a web of regulations, targets, and incentives, each defensible on its own, but collectively punitive to savers. Over time, repression reshapes the financial landscape. Risk is redefined. Safety becomes synonymous with compliance, and savers are left choosing between gradual loss and uncertain alternatives. This is why financial repression rarely ends voluntarily. It ends when inflation escapes control, when trust breaks, or when structural reform becomes unavoidable. Until then, savers continue to pay, not in dramatic losses, but in steady erosion. To understand why this system persists politically, we need to look beyond economics and into incentives. Specifically, why inflation remains one of the most convenient tools a government can use. Inflation survives not because it is popular, but because it is politically efficient. From a government's perspective, few tools offer the same combination of flexibility, deniability, and delayed consequences. Taxes are explicit. They require legislation. They provoke resistance. They create clear winners and losers. Spending cuts are even harder. They concentrate pain. They mobilize opposition. They force difficult trade-offs into public view. Inflation avoids these costs. It operates without a single vote. It does not arrive with a bill. It does not demand public consent. Instead, it spreads its effects thinly across time and society. When prices rise, responsibility becomes blurred. Businesses are blamed for greed. Supply chains are blamed for shortages. External events are blamed for disruption. Rarely does accountability trace back to the underlying policy choice, expanding money to finance obligations that taxation alone cannot support. This diffusion of blame is central to inflation's political appeal. Inflation also aligns with short-term incentives. Elections operate on short cycles. Debt and deficits unfold over decades. Inflation allows governments to bridge that gap. It creates immediate fiscal relief while postponing visible costs. Budgets balance more easily in nominal terms. Debt ratios improve without explicit austerity. Even central banks, designed to be independent, face pressure within this environment. Targets replace constraints. Acceptable inflation becomes institutionalized. Temporary overshoots are normalized. The language shifts. Inflation is no longer something to be avoided. It is something to be managed, contained,
guided. This framing matters. Once inflation is treated as a tool rather than a failure, resistance weakens. Debate narrows to degree, not principle. For savers, this shift is decisive. There is no constituency advocating for stable purchasing power. Borrowers are more numerous. Spending creates visible benefits. Erosion does not. This imbalance explains why inflation often persists long after its original justification fades. Crises end. Policies remain. What began as an emergency response becomes a permanent feature of the system. And because inflation rarely produces a single moment of reckoning, it can continue quietly, reshaping incentives, expectations, and behavior without triggering immediate backlash. To understand the full cost of this convenience, we now need to look at who ultimately bears it and how it changes society over time. Inflation does not affect society evenly. Its costs are concentrated, but quietly. The group most exposed is not the wealthy or the politically connected. It is the middle class. Middle-income households rely on wages, savings, and fixed contracts. They save in local currency. They plan long-term. They expect stability to reward discipline. Inflation undermines all three. Wages adjust slowly. Prices adjust quickly. The gap is absorbed by households with the least flexibility. Fixed income groups suffer even more. Pensioners, retirees, and savers living off interest experience inflation as a direct cut to their standard of living. Their income remains nominally intact, but its purchasing power shrinks year after year. No announcement is made. No compensation is offered. Over time, behavior changes. People stop saving for the long term. They spend sooner. They seek assets that feel more tangible. Trust in institutions weakens. This shift has consequences beyond finance. When money loses reliability, planning becomes harder. Families delay commitments. Businesses shorten horizons. Risk-taking increases, not because people wanted to, but because stability no longer protects them. Inflation also widens inequality in less obvious ways. Those with access to assets, leverage, and early exposure to new money adjust faster. Those without remain exposed to rising costs and falling real income. The divide grows quietly. Perhaps the most damaging cost is psychological.